Chapter 17 of The Witch of Salem. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Witch of Salem by John R. Musick. Chapter 17. Out of the frying pan into the fire. Though high the warm red torrent ran between the flames that lit the sky, yet for each drop an armed man shall rise to free the land or die. Bryant. The liberated prisoners went whithersoever they pleased. Some went to Boston, others to Plymouth, many to New York, New Jersey, and Maryland, while a few returned to England. They were wearied with their experience in the New World, and were content to spend their days in England. Charles Stevens retained a firm hold on his mother and Cora, until it was quite evident that their pursuers had, for the present at least, given up the chase. They went on in the forest until they were joined by 5 savages left to guard Joel Martin. Martin was no longer with them. Charles did not inquire what had become of him, for he was wholly engrossed in the safety of Cora and his mother. The Indians and the Waters brothers were engaged in a consultation. Charles took no part in the consultation, for he knew nothing to advise. Then the Indians accompanied them for a few miles through the woods. The forest was dark and somber, and they had only the silent stars to light their path, until the tardy moon, rising at a late hour, filled the landscape with silver light. Day dawned, and they were in a wild, picturesque wood, with towering hills and stupendous oaks on every side. Here they halted again for consultation. Audiobooks, after giving them all the provisions he had with him, took his warriors and stole off into the forest. George Waters and his brother urged the escaped prisoners to eat some dried venison and parched corn and sleep. They did. Indian blankets on the ground afforded them beds, and their only covering was the sky. Charles slept until the afternoon was almost spent, and then he was awakened by the tramp of horses' feet. He started up and found 3 Indians with 5 horses saddled and bridled. The Indians belonged to the braves of Audiobooks, and without a word they dismounted and turned over the horses to the Englishmen, and stole away into the forest. A few moments later the white people were mounted and riding away through one of the narrow paths known only to the Waters brothers. Charles Stevens' soul was too full for him to give heed to what course they took. His mother and Cora were free, though he had little dreamed that they were escaping from one danger to another. They arrived one night at the home of Mr. Dustin, near Haverhill in Massachusetts. When the frontiersman heard their story, he said, "You are welcome, my persecuted friends, to the shelter of my roof, so long as it can afford you any protection. But the war clouds seem to grow darker and more lowering every moment, and I don't know how long my roof will afford protection to anyone." Charles Stevens had been so busy with his own cares and griefs that he had forgotten that a terrible Indian war was raging on the frontier. This war was known as King William's War, in which the French joined with the Indians in bringing fire and sword against the inhabitants of New England and New York. The French and English had long been jealous of each other, and a connected account need not be given here of all the disastrous occurrences which led up to the terrible assault on Haverhill, where the fugitives from Salem were stopping. We will mention, as first of the principal attacks during the War of King William, the attack on Schenectady. This was made in pursuance of a plan adopted by Count Frontenac, the governor of Canada, as a means of avenging the English colonies the treatment of King James, deposed by William and Mary, which had inflamed the resentment of Frontenac's master, Louis XIV. While New York was torn with internal strife over Leisler, the governor of Canada fitted out 3 expeditions against the colonies, and in the midst of winter one was sent against New York. The attack on Schenectady was the fruit of this expedition. It was made by a party consisting of about 200 French and 50 Kanagawa Indians, under the command of Mallet and St. Helene, in 1689 and 1690. Schenectady was built in the form of an oblong square, with a gate at either extremity. The enemy found one of the gates not only opened, but unguarded. Although the town was impaled and might have been protected, there was so little thought of danger that no one deemed it necessary to close the gate. The weather was very cold, and the English did not suppose an attack would be made. It was 11:30 on Saturday night, February 8th, 1690, when the enemy entered, divided their party, waylaid every portal, and began the attack with a terrible war whoop. Mallet attacked the garrison, where the only resistance was made. He soon forced the gate, slew the soldiers, and burned the garrison. One of the French officers was wounded in forcing a house, but St. Helene came to his aid. The house was taken, and all in it were put to the sword. Naught was now to be seen save massacre and pillage on every side, while the most shocking barbarities were practiced on the unfortunate inhabitants. 63 houses and the church were immediately in a blaze, says a contemporaneous writer. Weak women, in their expiring agonies, saw their infants cast into the flames, or brained before their eyes. 63 persons were murdered, and 27 carried into captivity. A few persons were enabled to escape, but being without sufficient clothing, some perished in the cold before they reached Albany. About noon next day, the enemy left the desolate place, taking such plunder as they could carry with them, and destroying the remainder. It was the intention of Mallet to spare the minister, for he wanted him as his own prisoner, but he was found among the mangled dead, and his papers burned. 2 or 3 houses were spared, while the others were consigned to the flames. Owing to the wretched conditions of the roads and the deep snows, news of the massacre did not reach the great Mohawk castle, only 17 miles distant, for 2 days. On receipt of the terrible news, an armed party set out at once in pursuit of the foe. After a long, tedious march through the snow and forest, they came upon their rear, and a furious fight followed, in which about 25 of them were killed and wounded. A second party of French and Indians was sent against the delightful settlement of Salmon Falls, on the Piscataqua. At 3 Rivers, Frontenac had fitted out an expedition of 52 men and 25 Indians, with Sieur Hertel as their leader. In this small band he had 3 sons and 2 nephews. After a long and rugged march, Hertel reached the place on the 27th of March, 1690. His spies having reconnoitered it, he divided his men into 3 companies, leading the largest himself. Just at dawn of the day the attack was made. The English stoutly resisted, but were unable to withstand the well-directed fire of their assailants. 30 of the bravest defenders fell. The remainder, amounting to 54, were made prisoners. The English had 27 houses reduced to ashes, and 2,000 domestic animals perished in the barns that were burned. The third party, which was fitted out at Quebec by the directions of Frontenac, made an attack upon Casco in Maine. The expedition was commanded by Monsieur de Portneuf. Hertel, on his return to Canada, met with this expedition, and, joining it with the force under his command, came back to the scene of warfare in which he had been so unhappily successful. As the hostile army marched through the country of the Abenakis, numbers of them joined in. Portneuf, with his forces thus augmented, came into the neighborhood of Casco, about the 25th of May, 1690. On the following night, an Englishman who entered the well-laid ambush was captured and killed. This so excited the Indians that they raised the war whoop. 50 English soldiers were sent from the fort to ascertain the occasion of the yelling, and were drawn into the ambuscade. A volley from the woods on either side swept them down, and before the remainder could recover from the panic into which they were thrown by the volley, they were assailed with swords, bayonets, and tomahawks, and but 4 out of the party escaped, and these with severe wounds. The English, seeing now that they must stand a siege, abandoned 4 garrisons, and all retired into one which was provided with cannon. Before these were abandoned, an attack was made upon one of them, in which the French were repulsed, with an Indian killed and a Frenchman wounded. Portneuf now began to doubt his ability to take Casco, fearing the issue, for his commission only ordered him to lay waste the English settlements, and not to attempt fortified places. But in this dilemma, Hertel and Hopwood, a celebrated chief of the tribe of Kennebec, arrived. It was now determined to press the siege. In the deserted forts they found all the necessary tools for carrying on the work, and they began a mine within 50 feet of the fort, under a steep bank, which entirely protected them from its guns. The English became discouraged, and on the 28th of May surrendered themselves as prisoners of war. There were 70 men, and probably a greater number of women and children, all of whom, except Captain Davis, who commanded the garrison, and 3 or 4 others, were given up to the Indians, who murdered most of them in their most cruel manner, and, if the accounts be true, Hopwood excelled all other savages in acts of cruelty. These barbarous transactions produced both terror and indignation in New York and New England, and an attempt at a formidable demonstration against the enemy was made. The General Court of Massachusetts sent letters of request to the several executives of the provinces, pursuant to which they convened at New York, May 1st, 1661. As a result of the deliberations, 2 important measures were adopted. Connecticut sent General Winthrop with troops to march through Albany, there to receive supplies, and be joined by a body of men from New York. The expedition was to proceed up Lake Champlain to destroy Montreal. There was a failure, however, of the supplies, and this project was defeated. Massachusetts sent forth a fleet of 34 sail under William Phips. He proceeded to Port Royal, took it, reduced Acadia, and thence sailed up the St. Lawrence with the design of capturing Quebec. The troops landed with some difficulty, and the place was boldly summoned to surrender. A proud defiance was returned by Frontenac, as his position at the time happened to be strengthened by the reinforcement from Montreal. Phips, learning this, and finding also the party of Winthrop, which he had expected at Montreal, failed, gave up the attempt and returned to Boston, with the loss of several vessels and a considerable number of troops, for a part of his fleet was wrecked by a storm. It was in the midst of such trying scenes and devastation on the part of the French and savages that superstition and fanaticism broke loose in Salem and produced a reign of terror far greater than that caused by the savages on the frontier. It was from such scenes to such scenes that Charles Stevens, his mother and friends fled. Mr. Dustin lived near Haverhill in Massachusetts, and when they appealed to him for shelter and protection, he said, "To such as I have you are welcome, but I assure you it is poor. The savage scalping knife may be more dangerous than the fanatic's noose in Salem." They had been at Haverhill but a few weeks when, as Charles and Mr. Henry Waters were one day returning from a hunt, they discovered a man trailing them. "It's a white man," Charles remarked. "So I perceive. And why should he trail us?" Henry Waters asked. "I know not, but let us ascertain." They halted at the creek near Haverhill, and were sitting on the banks of the stream when a voice from the rocks above demanded their surrender. Looking up, they found themselves covered with 3 rifles. 3 white men, one of whom they recognized as Mr. Joel Martin, the Virginian, stepped out from behind the rocks and advanced toward them, assuring them that any effort to escape or resist would result in instant death. "I have you at last, murderer," cried Martin, seizing Henry Waters. "No, you mistake," began Charles, but Henry Waters signed to him to keep quiet. The Waters brothers, as the reader is aware, were twins, and looked so much alike that it was difficult to distinguish one from the other. Charles was not slow to grasp at the idea of Henry Waters. He would suffer himself to be taken to Virginia in his brother's stead, where he would make his identity known and establish an alibi. But there was danger of the revengeful Martin killing his prisoner before they reached Virginia, and Charles said, "Will you promise, on your honor as a Virginian, not to harm the prisoner until he reaches a court of justice?" The Virginian gave his promise, and then the 3 led Mr. Waters hurriedly away, mounted horses, hastened to Boston, and took a vessel for Virginia. Charles Stevens went to Mr. George Waters and told him what had happened. Mr. Waters' face grew troubled, but he said nothing. That night there was an alarm of savages in the neighborhood, and Charles Stevens and Mr. Waters went with a trained band to meet the foe. In a skirmish, Mr. Waters was wounded, and it was thought best for him to go to Boston for medical treatment. "I have friends and relatives there," Charles said, "and we might be safe." Next day the 4 secretly set out for Boston, where they lodged for a while with some relatives of Charles and his mother, who kept their presence a secret. Before concluding this chapter, it is the duty of the author, although stepping aside from the narrative, to relate what befell their brave friends the Dustons during the progress of King William's War. The atrocities committed upon the colonists by the French and Indians were equal to any recorded in the annals of barbarous ages. Connected with these were instances of heroic valor on the part of the heroic sufferers, which are not surpassed. On March 15th, 1697, the last year of King William's War, an attack was suddenly made on Haverhill by a party of about 20 Indians. It was a rapid but fatal onset, and a fitting finale of so dreadful a 10 years' war. 8 houses were destroyed, 27 persons killed, and 13 carried away prisoners. One of these houses, standing in the outskirts of the village, and in fact over the hill, so as to be almost out of sight of the people in the town, was the home of Mr. Dustin, the house which had afforded shelter to the fugitives from the Salem witchcraft persecution. On that fatal morning Mr. Dustin had gone to the field to commence his spring work. The season was early, and the plow and shovel had already begun to turn over the rich black soil. The industrious farmer had but just harnessed his horse when the animal began to sniff the air, and turning his eyes toward some bushes, Mr. Dustin discovered 2 painted faces with heads adorned by feathers. At the same moment a rattling crash of firearms and a terrible war whoop announced the attack on Haverhill. He unharnessed his horse, seized his gun, which he always kept near at hand, and galloped away like the wind toward the house, pursued by arrows of the Indians. Reaching the house before the Indians, he cried to his family to fly, and he would cover their retreat. "Mrs. Neff, take Mrs. Dustin and fly for your lives," he cried. Mrs. Dustin had an infant but a few days old, and was confined to her bed. Mrs. Neff was her nurse. The husband made an attempt to remove his wife, but it was too late. The Indians, like ravenous wolves, were rushing on the house. Mrs. Dustin turned to her husband and said, "Go, Thomas, you cannot save me. Go and save the children." Moved by her urgent appeal, he leaped on his horse and, with his gun in his hand, galloped away after the children, 7 in number, who were already running down the road. The first thought of the father was to seize one, place it on the horse before him, and escape, but he was unable to select one from the others. All were alike dear to him, and he resolved to defend all or perish in the effort. They had reached a point below the town where the road ran between 2 hills in a narrow pass. A party of Indians, 11 in number, had seen the children and were running after them. Mr. Dustin spurred his horse between the children and the savage foe, and shouting to his darlings to fly, and bidding the oldest carry the youngest, he drew rein at the pass and cocked his gun. Thomas Dustin was a dead shot, and his rifle was the best made at that day. Facing the savages, he fired and shot the leader dead in his tracks. His followers were appalled at the fate of their brawny chieftain, and for a moment hesitated. Mr. Dustin hesitated not a single instant, but proceeded without a moment's delay to reload his gun. 5 of the Indians fired at the resolute father as he rode away after his flying children. "Run, run, run for your lives!" he shouted. The Indians, with a whoop of vengeance, followed the father. He had 4 balls in his gun, and, wheeling his horse about, he fired this terrible charge at them. Though none were killed instantly at this shot, 3 were wounded, 2 so severely that they died the next day. The Indians abandoned the pursuit of the resolute father, who continued the fight as he retreated, and turned their attention to less dangerous victories, so Mr. Dustin escaped with his children. Mrs. Neff, the nurse in attendance on Mrs. Dustin, heroically resolved to share the fate of her patient, even though she could have escaped. The Indians entered the house, and having made the sick woman rise and sit quietly in the corner of the fireplace, they pillaged the dwelling and set it on fire, taking the occupants out of it. At the approach of night, Mrs. Dustin was forced to march into the wilderness and seek repose on the hard, cold ground. Mrs. Neff attempted to escape with the baby, but was intercepted. The infant had its brains beaten out against a tree, and the body was thrown into the bushes. The captives of Haverhill, when collected, were 13 miserable, wretched people. That same day they were marched 12 miles before camping, although it was nearly night before they set out. Succeeding this, for several days they were compelled to keep up with the savage captors over an extent of country of not less than 140 or 50 miles. Feeble as she was, it seemed wonderful that Mrs. Dustin should have borne up under the trials and fatigues of the journey, but she did. After this, the Indians, according to their custom, divided their prisoners. Mrs. Dustin, Mrs. Neff, and a captive lad from Worcester fell to the share of an Indian family consisting of 12 persons. These now took charge of the captives and treated them with no particular unkindness, save that of forcing them to extend their journey still further toward an Indian settlement. One day they told the prisoners that there was one ceremony to which they must submit after their arrival at their destination, and that was running the gauntlet between 2 files of Indians. This announcement filled Mrs. Dustin and her companions with so much dread that they mutually resolved to make a desperate attempt to escape. Mrs. Hannah Dustin, Mrs. Mary Neff, the nurse, and the lad, Samuel Leonardson, only 11 years of age, were certainly not persons to excite the fear of a dozen sturdy warriors. The Indians believed the lad faithful to them, and never dreamed that the women would have courage enough to attempt to escape, and no strict watch was kept over them. In order to throw the savage captors off their guard, Mrs. Dustin seemed to take well to them, and on the day before the plan of escape was carried out, she ascertained through inquiries made by the lad how to kill a man instantly and how to take off his scalp. "Strike him here," the Indian explained, placing his finger on his temple, "and take off his scalp so," showing the lad how it was done. With this information, the plot was ripe. Just before dawn of day, when the Indians sleep most profound, Mrs. Dustin softly arose from her bed of earth and touched Mary Neff on the shoulder. A single touch was sufficient to awake her, and she sat up. Next the lad had to be aroused. Being young and wearied, his slumbers were profound. An Indian lay near asleep. Mrs. Dustin seized his tomahawk, and Mrs. Neff seized another Indian's weapons. The nurse shook Samuel. The lad rose, rubbed his eyes, and went over to where the man lay who had instructed him in the art of killing. He seized his hatchet and held it in his hand ready. At a signal from Mrs. Dustin, 3 blows fell on 3 temples, and with a quiver, 3 sleepers in life had passed to the sleep of death. Once more the hatchets were raised, and 6 of the 12 were dead. The little noise they were compelled to make disturbed the slumbers of the others, and the 3 hatchets, now red with blood, fell on 3 more. Mrs. Neff, growing nervous and excited, cut her man's head a little too far forward, and he started up with a yell. The blood blinded him, however, and she stabbed him. The yell had roused the others, and a squaw with a child fled to the woods, while the 10th, a young warrior, was assailed by Mrs. Dustin and the lad and slain ere he was fully awake. 10 of the 12 were dead, and the escaped prisoners, after scuttling all the boats save one to prevent pursuit, started in that down the river with what provisions they could take from the Indians. They had not gone far when Mrs. Dustin said, "We have not scalped the Indians." "Why should we?" asked Mrs. Neff. "When we get home and tell our friends that we slew 10 Indians, they will demand some proof of the assertion, and the 10 scalps will be proof." Samuel Leonardson, boylike, was anxious to have the scalps of his foes, so they overruled Mrs. Neff, and turning about went back to the camp, which was now deserted save by the ghastly dead, their glassy eyes gazing upward at the skies. "This is the way he told me to do it," said Samuel, seizing the tuft of hair on the head of the man who had instructed him in scalping. He ran the keen edge of a knife around the skull, and by a quick jerk pulled off the scalp. Being novices in the art, it took them some time to remove the scalps from the heads of all, but the bloody task was finally accomplished, and putting the scalps in a bag, they once more embarked in the Indian canoe and started down the stream. With strong hearts the 3 voyagers went down the Merrimac to their homes, every moment in peril from savages or the elements, and were received as persons risen from the dead. Mrs. Dustin found her husband and children saved. Soon after, she went to Boston, carrying with her a gun and a tomahawk, which she had brought from the wigwam, and her 10 trophies, and the General Court of Massachusetts gave these brave sufferers £50 as a reward for their heroism. Ex-Governor Nicholson of Maryland sent a metal tankard to Mrs. Dustin and Mrs. Neff as a token of his admiration. The tankard is now, 1875, in the possession of Mr. Emery Coffin of Newburyport, Massachusetts. During the summer of 1874, 177 years after the event, citizens of Massachusetts and New Hampshire erected on the highest point of Dustin's Island an elegant monument commemorative of the heroic deed. It displays a figure of Mrs. Dustin holding in her right hand, raised in the attitude of striking, a tomahawk, and a bunch of scalps in the other. On it are inscribed the names of Hannah Dustin, Mary Neff, and Samuel Leonardson, the English lad. Haverhill was a second time attacked and desolated during King William's War, and other places suffered. The treaty at Ryswick, a village near the Hague in Holland, soon after put an end to the indiscriminate slaughter in Europe and America. At this insignificant little village a peace was agreed upon between Louis XIV of France and England, Spain and Holland, and the German Empire, which ended a war of more than 7 years' duration. Louis was compelled to acknowledge William of Orange to be the sovereign of England. The war cost Great Britain $150 millions in cash, besides $100 millions loaned. The latter laid the foundation of England's enormous national debt, which today amounts to $5,000 millions. Prior to the Treaty of Ryswick, a Board of Trade and Plantations was established in England, whose duty it was to have a general oversight of the affairs of the American colonies. It was a permanent commission, the members of which were called Lords of Trade and Plantations. It consisted of 7 members with a president, and was always a ready instrument of oppression in the hands of the sovereign, and became a powerful promoter of those discontents in the colonies which broke out in open rebellion in 1775. The Peace of Ryswick was of short duration. Aspirants for power again tormented the people with the evils of war. King James II died in France, September 1701. He had been shielded by Louis after his flight from his throne to France, and now the French monarch acknowledged James's son, James Francis Edward, known in history as the Pretender, to be the lawful king of England. This act greatly offended the English, because the crown had been settled upon Anne, James's second Protestant daughter. Louis, in addition, had offended the English by placing his grandson, Philip of Anjou, on the throne of Spain, so increasing the influence of France among the dynasties of Europe. King William was enraged, and was preparing for war, when a fall from his horse while hunting caused his death. He was succeeded by Anne, and a war ensued, which lasted almost a dozen years, and is known in history as Queen Anne's War. We have, however, too long dwelt on the general history of the country. It will be essential to our story that we return to the village of Salem, where superstition was reigning, while the chief characters of our story were resting in security at Boston, not daring to go abroad by day. End of chapter 17. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas.
Chapter 18 of The Witch of Salem. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Vira. The Witch of Salem by John R. Musick. Chapter 18. Superstition Reigns. The awful tragedy was through, and friends and enemies withdrew. Some smite their breasts, and trembling say, unlawful deeds were done today. Paxton. After the escape of Mrs. Stevens and Cora Waters, a wave of superstition swept over the village of Salem with such irresistible fury that it seemed in greater danger than the frontier settlements did from the French and Indians. The nurse family and all their relatives came in for a greater share than any other. Mrs. Cloyse was second of the family to be accused by Parris and his minions. Mrs. Cloyse drew ill will upon herself at the outset by doing as her brother and sister nurse did. They all absented themselves from the examinations in the church, and, when the interruptions of the services became too flagrant, from Sabbath worship. They declared that they took that course because they disapproved of the permission given to the profanation of the place and the service. At last Mrs. Cloyse, or Goody Cloyse as she was called in the records of the day, was arrested. Mary Easty and Elizabeth Proctor were also arrested. Mary Easty, sister of Mrs. Nurse, was tried and condemned. On her condemnation and sentence, she made an effective memorial while under sentence of death, and fully aware of the hopelessness of her case, addressing the judges, the magistrates, and the reverend ministers, imploring them to consider what they were doing, and how far their course in regard to accused persons was inconsistent with the principles and rules of justice. "I ask nothing for myself," she said. "I am satisfied with my own innocence, and certain of my doom on earth and my hope in heaven. What I do desire is to induce the authorities to take time, and to use caution in receiving, and strictness in sifting testimony, and so shall they ascertain the truth, and absolve the innocent, the blessing of God being upon your conscious endeavors." No effect was produced by her warnings or remonstrances. Before setting forth from the jail to the Witches' Hill on the day of her death, she serenely bade farewell to her husband and children, and many of her friends, some of whom afterwards related that her sayings were so serious, religious, distinct, and affectionate, as could well be expressed, drawing tears from the eyes of all present. The subject of witchcraft grew more interesting after the execution of Mary Easty, and to examine Elizabeth Proctor and Sarah Cloyse, or Cloyce, as Mr. Bancroft spells the name, the deputy governor and 5 magistrates went to Salem. It was a great day. Several ministers were present. Parris officiated, and, by his own record, it is plain that he himself elicited every accusation. His first witness, John, the West India negro servant, husband to Tituba, was rebuked by Sarah Cloyse as a grievous liar. Abigail Williams, the niece to Parris, was also at hand, with her wonderful tales of sorcery. She swore she had seen the prisoner at the witch's sacrament. Struck with horror at such bold perjury, Sarah Cloyse called for water, and swooned away before it could be brought her. Upon this, Abigail Williams, her brother's wife, Sarah Williams, Parris's daughter, and Ann Putnam, shouted, "Her spirit is gone to prison to her sister." Against Elizabeth Proctor, Abigail Williams related stories that were so foolish that one wonders how any sensible person could believe them. Among other things, she told how the accused had invited her to sign the devil's book. "Dear child," exclaimed the accused, in her agony, "it is not so. There is another judgment, dear child," and her accusers, turning toward her husband, declared that he, too, was a wizard. All 3 were committed. Examinations and commitments multiplied. Giles Corey, a stubborn old man of more than 80 years, could not escape the malice of his minister and his angry neighbors, with whom he had quarreled. Parris had had a rival in George Burroughs, a graduate of Harvard College, who, having formerly preached in Salem village, had friends there desirous of his return. He was a skeptic on the subject of witchcraft, and Parris determined to have his revenge on him, and, through his many agents and instruments, had him accused and committed. Thus far there had been no success in obtaining confessions, though earnestly solicited. It had been strongly hinted that a confession was an avenue of safety. At last, Deliverance Hobbs owned everything that was asked of her, and left unharmed. The gallows was to be set up, not for those who professed themselves witches, but for those who rebuked the delusion. On May 14th, the new charter and the royal governor arrived in Boston. On the next Monday, the charter was published, and the parishioner of Cotton Mather, with the royal council, was installed in office. The triumph of Cotton Mather was complete. A court of oyer and terminer was immediately instituted by ordinance, and the positive, overbearing Stoughton was appointed by the governor and council as its chief judge, with Sewell and Waite Winthrop, 2 feebler men, as his associates. By the 2nd of June, the court was in session at Salem, making its experiment on Bridget Bishop, a poor and friendless old woman. the fact of witchcraft was assumed as notorious. To fix it on the prisoner, Samuel Parris, who had examined her before her commitment, was the principal witness to her power of inflicting torture. He had seen it exercised. Then came the testimony of the bewitched, and a terrible mess of stuff it was. One, on reading it, might suppose that all the inmates of Bedlam had been summoned into court to give their personal experience in the land of insanity. Many of the witnesses testified that the shape of the prisoner often grievously tormented them by pinching, choking, or biting them, and did otherwise seriously afflict them, urging them all the while to write their names in a book, which the spectre called "our book." Sarah Williams, who was devotedly attached to Mr. Parris and his cause, swore that it was the shape of this prisoner, with Cora Waters, which one day took her from her wheel, and, carrying her to the riverside, threatened to drown her if she did not sign the book mentioned, which she yet refused to do. Others said that the witch in her shape, that is, appearing to them in a spiritual body, invisible to any, save the parties before whom she would appear, boasted that she had ridden John Bly, having first changed him into a horse. One testified to seeing ghosts of dead people, who declared that Bridget Bishop had murdered them. While the examination of the accused was in progress, the bewitched seemed extremely tortured. If she turned her eyes on them, they were struck down. While they lay in swoons or convulsions, the poor old woman was made to touch them, and they immediately sprang to their feet. Samuel Parris had his minions well trained. On any special action of her body, shaking of her head, or the turning of her eyes, they imitated her posture, and seemed under some strange spell. Evidence was given that one of the bewitched persons persuaded a man to strike at the spot where the shape of this bishop stood, and the bewitched cried out, "You have tore her coat," and it was found that the woman's dress was torn in the very place. Deliverance Hobbs, who had confessed to being a witch, now testified that she was tormented by the spectres for her confession, and she now testified that this bishop tempted her to sign the book again, and to deny what she had confessed. "It was the shape of this prisoner," she declared, "which whipped me with iron rods to compel me thereunto, and I furthermore saw Bridget Bishop at a general meeting of the witches in a field at Salem village, where they partook of a diabolical sacrament in bread and wine then ministered." John Cook testified: "About 5 or 6 years ago, one morning, about sunrise, I was in my chamber assaulted by the shape of this prisoner, which looked on me, grinned at me, and very much hurt me with a blow on the side of the head, and on the same day, about noon, the same shape walked into the room where I was, and an apple strangely flew out of my hand." Samuel Gray testified: "About 14 years ago, I waked on a night, and saw the room wherein I lay full of light. Then I plainly saw a woman between the cradle and the bedside, which looked upon me. I rose, and it vanished, though I found all the doors fast. Looking out at the entry door, I saw the same woman in the same garb again, and I said, 'In God's name, what do you come for?' I went to bed, and had the same woman again assaulting me. The child in the cradle gave a great screech, and the woman disappeared. It was long before the child could be quieted, and though it was a very likely, thriving child, yet from this time it pined away, and after divers months died in a sad condition. I knew not Bishop then, nor her name, but when I saw her after this, I knew her by her countenance and apparel and all circumstances, that it was the apparition of this bishop which had thus troubled me." John Bly testified: "I bought a sow of Edmund Bishop, the husband of the prisoner, and was to pay the price agreed upon to another person. This prisoner, being angry that she was thus hindered from fingering the money, quarrelled with me, soon after which the sow was taken with strange fits, jumping and leaping and knocking her head against the fence. She seemed blind and deaf and could not eat, whereupon my neighbor, John Louder, said he believed the creature was overlooked, and there were sundry other circumstances concurred, which made me believe that Bishop had bewitched it. The examining magistrates asked Bly, "Have you ever been transformed by the prisoner?" "I have," Bly answered. "When was it?" "Last summer. One night, as I was coming home late, the shape of the prisoner came at me. She shook a bridle over my head, and I became a horse. Then she mounted me, rode me several leagues, and the bridle was removed, and I lay in my bed." John Louder, another acquaintance of Charles Stevens, was called next. John had had his experience with witches. He was an ardent admirer of Mr. Parris, and one of his emissaries. Louder, Bly, and, in fact, all of Parris's tools were ignorant, bigoted, and superstitious. They could be made to believe anything the pastor would tell them. Louder testified, "I had some little controversy with Bishop about her fowls. Going well to bed, I did awake in the night by moonlight, and did see clearly the likeness of this woman grievously oppressing me, in which miserable condition she held me, unable to help myself till near day. I told Bishop of this, but she denied it, and threatened me very much. Quickly after this, being at home on a Lord's day, with the doors shut about me, I saw a black pig approach me, at which I, going to kick, it vanished away. Immediately after sitting down, I saw a black thing jump in at the window, and come and stand before me. The body was like that of a monkey, the feet like a cock's, but the face was much like a man's. I was so extremely affrighted that I could not speak. This monster spoke to me and said, 'I am a messenger sent unto you, for I understand that you are in some trouble of mind, and if you be ruled by me, you shall want nothing in this world.' Whereupon I endeavored to clap my hands upon it, but I could feel no substance, and it jumped out of the window again, but immediately came in by the porch, though the doors were shut, and said, 'You had better take my counsel.' Whereupon I struck at it with my stick, but struck only the ground cell, and broke my stick. The arm with which I struck was presently disenabled, and it vanished away. I presently went out the porch door, and spied this Bishop in her orchard, going toward her house, but I had not the power to set one foot toward her. Whereupon, returning into the house, I was immediately accosted by the monster I had seen before, which goblin was now going to fly at me, whereat I did cry out, 'The whole armor of God be between me and you!' So it sprang back and flew over the apple tree, shaking many apples off the tree in its flying over. At its leap, it flung dirt with its feet against my stomach, whereon I was then struck dumb, and so continued for 3 days together." The records of the case on trial shows that William Stacy testified, "I received money of this Bishop for work done by me, and I was gone but a matter of 3 rods from her, when, looking for my money, I found it unaccountably gone from me. Some time after, Bishop asked me if my father would grind her grist for her. I demanded why not. 'Because folks count me a witch.' I answered, 'No question but he will grind it for you.' Being gone about 6 rods from her, with a small load in my cart, suddenly the off wheel stumped, and sank down into a hole, upon plain ground, so that I was forced to get help for the recovering of the wheel, but stepping back to look for the hole which might give me this disaster, there was none at all to be found. Some time after, I was waked in the night, but it seemed as light as day, and I perfectly saw the shape of this Bishop in the room, troubling me, but upon her going out all was dark again. When I afterward charged Bishop with it, she did not deny it, but was very angry. Quickly after this, having been threatened by Bishop, as I was again in a dark night, going to the barn, I was very suddenly taken or lifted from the ground and thrown against a stone wall. After that, I was hoisted up and thrown down a bank at the end of my house. After this, again passing by this Bishop, my horse with a small load, striving to draw, all his gears flew to pieces, and the cart fell down, and I, going to lift a bag of corn of about 2 bushels, could not budge it. The foregoing is a sample of the testimony on which people were hung. We have given these that the reader may see what firm hold Mr. Parris and superstition had on the people. We could give page after page of this testimony, but the above is sufficient. If the reader wants a fuller account of the trials of Bishop, Martin, or any of the unfortunates who suffered death at Salem during the reign of superstition, we refer them to the collections of Cotton Mather in his Invisible World. From that book we quote the following information, as elicited by the examination in case of Susanna Martin at Salem, June 29, 1692. Magistrate. Pray, what ails these people? Martin. I don't know. Magistrate. But what do you think of them? Martin. I don't desire to spend my judgment upon it. Magistrate. Don't you think they are bewitched? Martin. No, I do not think they are. Magistrate. Tell us your thoughts about them. Martin. No, my thoughts are my own, when they are in, but when they are out, they are another's, their master. Magistrate. Their master? Whom do you think is their master? Martin. If they be dealing in the black art, you may know as well as I. Magistrate. Well, what have you done toward this? Martin. Nothing at all. Magistrate. Why, 'tis you, or your appearance. Martin. I cannot help it. Magistrate. If it be not your master, how comes your appearance to hurt these? Martin. How do I know? He that appeared in the shape of Samuel, a glorified saint, may appear in any one's shape. No wonder that a writer, having occasion to examine into the evidence a few years ago, and commenting on it, should exclaim, Great God! And is this the road our ancestors had to travel in the pilgrimage in quest of freedom and Christianity? Are these the misunderstood doctrines of total depravity? Reverend Mr. Noyes seemed to rival Mr. Parris in the persecution of witches. You are a witch, you know you are, he said to Sarah Good while urging her to confession. You are a liar, the poor woman replied, and if you take my life, God will give you blood to drink. Confessions became important in the prosecutions. Some, not afflicted before confession, were so presently after it. The jails were filled, for fresh accusations were needed to confirm the confessions. Mr. Hale says, some, by these their accusations of others, hoped to gain time and get favor from the rulers. Some of the inferior sort of people did ill offices by promising favor thereby, more than they had ground to engage. Some, under these temptations, regarded not as they should what became of others, so that they could thereby serve their own turns. Some have since acknowledged so much. If the confessions were contradictory, if witnesses uttered apparent falsehoods, the devil, the judges would say, takes away their memory and imposes on their brain. Who, under such circumstances, would dare to be skeptical, or refuse to believe the confessors? Already 20 persons had been put to death for witchcraft. 55 had been tortured or terrified into penitent confessions. With accusations, confessions increased. With confessions, new accusations. Even the generation of the children of God were in danger of falling under that condemnation. The jails were full. 150 prisoners awaited trial. 200 more were accused or suspected. It was also observed that no one of the condemned confessing witchcraft had been hanged. No one that confessed and retracted a confession had escaped either hanging or imprisonment for trial. No one of the condemned who asserted innocence, even if one of the witnesses confessed to perjury, or if the foreman of the jury acknowledged the error of the verdict, escaped the gallows. Favoritism was shown in listening to accusations which were turned aside from friends or partisans. If a man began a career as a witch hunter, and, becoming convinced of the imposture, declined the service, he was accused and hanged. Samuel Parris had played a strong hand and was more than successful. His harvest of vengeance seemed to have no end. Witches' Hill became a Tyburn Hill, and as many as 8 were hung at one time. Matters had at last gone too far. The delusion reached its climax in the midsummer of 1692, and on the second Wednesday in October following, about a fortnight after the last hanging at Salem, the representatives of the colony assembled, and the people of Andover, their minister joining with them, appeared with their remonstrance against the doings of witch tribunals. "We know not," they said, "who can think himself safe, if the accusation of children and others under a diabolical influence shall be received against persons of good fame." The discussions which ensued were warm, for Mr. Parris had defenders even in the legislature, who denounced Charles and Hattie Stevens as murderers and exercisers of the black art. The General Court did not place itself in direct opposition to the advocates of the trials. It ordered a bill by a convocation of ministers, that the people might be led in the right way as to witchcraft. The reason for doing it, and the manner, was such that the judges of the court, so wrote one of them, consider themselves thereby dismissed. As to legislature, it adopted what King William rejected, the English law, word for word, as it was enacted by a House of Commons, in which Coke and Bacon were the guiding minds, but they abrogated the special court, and established a tribunal by statute. Phipps had, instantly on his arrival, employed his illegal court in hanging witches. The representatives of the people delayed the first assembling of the legal court till January of the following year. Thus, an interval of more than 3 months from the last executions gave the public mind security and freedom. Though Phipps conferred the place of chief judge on Stoughton, yet jurors, representing the public mind, had acted independently. When the court met at Salem, 6 women of Andover, at once renouncing their confessions, treated the witchcraft but as something so called, the bewildered but as seemingly afflicted. A memorial of like tenor came from the inhabitants of Andover. More than 1/2 of the cases presented were dismissed, and, though bills were found against 26 persons, the trials showed the feebleness of the testimony on which others had been condemned. The minds of the juries had become enlightened, even before the prejudiced judges. The same testimony was produced, and there at Salem, with Stoughton on the bench, verdicts of acquittal followed. One of the parties acquitted on this occasion was an old acquaintance. Mr. Henry Waters, who had been arrested for his brother and taken to Virginia, suddenly appeared in Salem. John Louder at once cried out against him and caused him to be arrested. On being arraigned, he pled not guilty and was put on his trial. John Louder was the principal witness, He stated that one day he and Bly were hunting, and that defendant pursued them and bewitched their guns. Then he testified that he fired a silver bullet and wounded the defendant. He also testified to his appearing before him on the evening he went to stalk deer, and offering him a book to sign. It was known that the accused had suffered from a wound. Mr. Waters then proceeded to explain: "My name is Henry Waters, and in early life my brother and I were players. We were members of the Church of England and detested the Catholic religion. The end of Charles II was drawing near, and we reasoned that James II, his brother, would become heir to the throne. Our only hope was to organize a strong party and seize the throne for the Duke of Monmouth. I was sent to the American colonies to secure pledges of support and get the names of all who would resist a papal monarch on my book. I came, leaving my brother and his child in England. On the way here, I was suddenly fired upon by an Indian in ambush and wounded in the side. As these men were stalking a deer, I passed along and affrighted the animal, so it ran away, and I was for this accused of being a wizard." He was then asked by the examining magistrate if he did offer a book to Mr. John Louder to sign. "I did," he quickly answered. "When was it?" "At the time and place he states." "What book was it?" "I have it here," and he produced a small red-backed blank book. "This has caused so much trouble. Examine it, and you will see. It was to contain only the names of those who would resist the accession of the Duke of York to the throne." The book was passed around to the judge and jury, and a smile dawned on the face of each, which was dangerous to the friends of the prosecution. That book would have hung Henry Waters during the reign of James II, but now it was his salvation. He was one of the first acquitted. The delusion was on the wane. Error died among its worshippers. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Witch of Salem. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Vira. The Witch of Salem by John R. Musick. Chapter 19. The Woman in Black. The greatest of thy follies is forgiven, even for the least of all the tears that shine on that pale face of thine. Thou didst kneel down to him who came from heaven, evil and ignorant, and thou shalt rise, holy and pure and wise. Bryant. Charles Stevens, his mother and Cora, and her wounded father found safety and shelter at the home of Richard Stevens in Boston. Richard Stevens was an uncle to Charles and a man past middle life, but noted for his practical common sense. Like all others of this noted family, he never rose high in either social or political circles. They were simply farmers or small tradesmen, with more than average intelligence, patriotic and honest as their great progenitor who came over with Columbus. Richard Stevens knew that the delusion of witchcraft could not last. In his house, which was among the best in Boston, save those occupied by the governors and officers, the fugitives, save Mr. Waters, remained all during the latter part of 1692. As soon as his wound was healed, George Waters mysteriously disappeared. He reached Williamsburg, Va., just after his brother was acquitted. He did not meet with Henry, for he had already taken a ship for Boston. George Waters went to Robert Stevens, where he made himself known and learned of his brother's acquittal. "The mistake was soon discovered," said Robert Stevens, "even before the case came on to be tried. Hearing that you had been arrested, I went to see you and discovered that they had the wrong man. Then I procured his release." George Waters thanked Mr. Stevens for what he had done. "What are you going to do now?" asked Robert. "I shall return to Boston." "He will never cease to follow you." No. Then Mr. Waters again became thoughtful, and Robert asked, "Are you going to slay him?" "No. Did Charles Stevens write to you?" "Yes." "Concerning the pardon?" "He did." "And have you done everything?" "Everything that can be done." "Do you bid me hope?" "Yes." That night George Waters set out by land to return to New England. It was a formidable journey in those days, and required many weeks. There were large rivers to be crossed, and he had to go to the headwaters before he could swim them. Many days and nights did the lone traveler spend in the forest. One afternoon he was suddenly aware of a man pursuing him. Instinctively he knew it was his enemy, Joel Martin. The man was alone, and George Waters, who was an expert marksman, could have waylaid and shot him. Martin came to seek his life, and, ordinarily, one might say that he was fully justified in killing him. George paused on the crest of a high hill, and with the declining sun full on him, watched the determined pursuer. "Joel Martin is a brave man," thought Mr. Waters. "He is as brave as he is revengeful." Martin was almost a mile away, but he clearly saw the figure of the horseman, and supposed he had halted to challenge him to battle. Martin unslung his rifle, and urged his jaded steed forward at a gallop, waving his weapon in the air. "I might be tempted to do it," George Waters thought, and he took his gun from his back, threw it on the ground, and rode away. Joel Martin, who witnessed the strange proceeding, was puzzled to know what it meant. He came up to the gun of his enemy, and saw him riding rapidly across the hills and rocks. "Now he is at my mercy," cried Martin. "The fool hath thrown away his gun to increase his speed." George Waters was fully a mile ahead of Joel Martin, when he heard the sharp report of a rifle, followed by the crack of 2 or 3 muskets, accompanied by an Indian yell. Waters felt his heart almost stand still. He sought shelter in a dense thicket on the banks of a stream, to await the shadows of night. He wondered what had become of Martin, and when he heard the yells of savages, as he frequently did, he asked himself if they were not torturing the unfortunate prisoner to death. When night came, he saw a bright fire burning further down the creek, and leaving his horse tied to a bush, the brave Englishman crept through the woods, crawling most of the way. At last he was near enough to see a score of savages sitting about a camp fire. Near by, tied to a tree, was the miserable Virginian. Mr. Waters saw that he had 2 wounds, and was no doubt suffering greatly. His horse had been killed, and afforded a feast for the savages, who evidently had not decided the rider's fate. Having feasted until their stomachs were overgorged, the Indians lay down upon the ground and fell asleep. Their prisoner was severely wounded and tied with stout deerskin thongs, so that it would be utterly impossible for him to escape, and in the heart of this great wilderness, the dusky sun slept in perfect security. George Waters crept up closer and closer to the prisoner, and had to actually crawl between 2 sleeping savages to reach him. Then he slowly rose at the feet of Martin, who, unable to sleep for pain, was the only human being in the camp awake. The prisoner saw him approaching, saw him draw his knife, and expected to be killed by his enemy, but he made no outcry. Better be stabbed to the heart by George Waters than tortured by his fiendish captors. George Waters cut the deerskin thongs which bound him to the tree, and in a whisper asked, "Can you walk?" "No." "I will carry you." He took the wounded man on his own broad shoulders, and carefully bore him from the camp. Not a word was said. Joel Martin's tongue seemed suddenly to have become paralyzed. George Waters walked slowly, carefully, and silently. The Indians slept. When they were some distance from the camp, Martin, entertaining but one idea of Waters' plans, said, "You have gone far enough with me. Stop right here and have it over with. I shall make no outcry." "Joel Martin, you are a brave man, I know," began Mr. Waters, but Martin again interrupted him. "I shall make no outcry. You have a knife in your belt. Stab me and be done with it." "I shall not." "Where are you going to take me?" "To my horse." Martin grumbled at the useless delay, but suffered himself to be carried to the horse. "Can you ride?" Waters asked. "Yes." "I will help you to the saddle, and if you think there is danger of your falling, I can tie you." He assisted the wounded man into the saddle, and took the rein in his hand, saying, "Hold, and I will lead." "George Waters, where are you going with me?" "To Virginia." "Can it be that you intend to spare my life?" "I have no occasion to take it." The crestfallen Virginian said no more. All night long they journeyed through the forests and across plains. At dawn of day they were among the mountains. They rested, and George Waters kept watch over the wounded man while he slept. By the middle of the afternoon they were on the march again. Mr. Martin's wounds were inflamed and sore, and he was in a fever. Next day they reached the village of some friendly Indians, and remained there 2 weeks, until the wounded man was able to proceed. George Waters went with him until they were in sight of a village on the upper James River. "I can go no further, Mr. Martin," said George Waters. "I understand," he returned, dismounting from the saddle. "Can you make your way to those houses?" "Yes." "I will take you nearer, if necessary." "It is not." George Waters cut 2 stout sticks with forks to place under his arms as crutches. Martin watched his acts of kindness, while a softer expression came over his face. He was about to go away, but turned about, and seizing Waters by the hand, cried, "God bless you! You are a man." Not willing to risk himself further, he turned away, and George Waters re-entered the forest. He reached Boston early in 1692, just after the acquittal of his brother and others of the charge of witchcraft. Everybody realizing that the madness had run its course, Charles Stevens and his mother went back to their home at Salem, confident that they need fear no more persecutions from Parris, whose power was gone. Next day after his arrival, while going down a lonely path near the village, Charles suddenly came upon Sarah Williams. Her eyes were blazing with the fires of hope, fanaticism, and disappointed pride. "Charles, Charles!" she cried. "Nay, do not turn away from me, for, as heaven is my witness, I did not have your mother cried out upon." "Sarah Williams, I am as willing as any to forget the past, or, if remember it I must, only think of it as a hideous nightmare, from which, thanks to Providence, we have escaped forever. Charles, let us be friends." "Far be it from me to be your enemy, Sarah Williams." "Can you not be more, Charles?" said the handsome widow, her dark eyes on the ground, while her cheek became suffused with a blush. "What mean you, Sarah Williams?" "You used to love me." The young man started and said, "You mistake." "I do not. You told me you did in the presence of Abigail Williams. At the same time you confessed to killing Samuel Williams in order to wed me." Charles Stevens was thunderstruck, and could only gaze in amazement on the bold, unscrupulous woman, who had trained under Parris until she was capable of almost any deception to carry her point. "Sarah Williams, what you say is a lie," he declared, in a hoarse whisper with amazement and indignation. "We shall see, we shall see," she answered, in a hoarse, shrill voice. "I will prove it. See, I will prove it, and hang you yet. Beware, I do not charge you with witchcraft, but with murder. Either take the place you made vacant by the death of Samuel Williams, or hang." As least of the 2 evils, Charles Stevens intimated he preferred to hang, and turning abruptly about, he left her. Next day he was met by Bly and Louder in the village, who interrogated him on his recent trouble with Sarah Williams about the dead husband. Knowing both to be outrageous liars, and unscrupulous as they were bold, he sought to avoid them, but they followed him everywhere and interrogated him, until he was utterly disgusted, and finally broke away and went home. Charles Stevens did not tell his mother of the threat of Sarah Williams, for he considered it too absurd to notice. 3 or 4 days later, when he had almost ceased to think of the matter, he and his mother were startled from their supper by hearing a loud knock at the front door. "Sit you still, Charles, and I will go and see who this late visitor is." She rose and went to the door and opened it. 3 or 4 dark forms stood without. "Is Charles Stevens in?" asked one. "Yes, sir." "I want to see him." "Who are you?" "Don't you know me, Hattie Stevens? I am the sheriff," said the speaker boldly, as he, unbidden, entered the house. "You the sheriff? What can you want here?" Turning to the men without, he said in an undertone, "Guard the doors." The dumbfounded mother repeated, "You the sheriff? What do you want here?" "I want to see that precious son of yours, Widow Stevens, and I trow he will guess the object of my visit." "My son? Surely he hath done no wrong. He hath broken no law." "Where is he?" The voice of the sheriff was pitched considerably above the ordinary key, and Charles Stevens, hearing it in the kitchen, became alarmed and hastened into the front apartment, saying, "I am here. Is it me you want to see?" "Yes, Charles Stevens, I arrest you in the king's name." "Arrest me? Marry, what offense have I done that I should be arrested by the king's officers?" "It is murder," he answered. "Murder!" shrieked both the mother and son. "Verily it is," answered the sheriff. Then he produced a warrant issued on the complaint of Sarah Williams, charging Charles Stevens with the murder of one Samuel Williams. Charles could scarcely believe his ears when he heard the warrant read. He had for a long time known Sarah Williams to be a bold, scheming woman, but that she would proceed to such a bold, desperate measure as this seemed impossible. "I am innocent," he declared, while his mother sank into a chair and buried her face in her hands. "It is ever thus. The most guilty wretch on earth is innocent, according to his tell," the sheriff answered. Charles Stevens besought the man not to confine him in jail, but he was told there was no help for it, and he was hurried away to prison, leaving his mother, overcome with grief, in her chair. It was some days before the news of Charles Stevens' arrest reached Boston. The prosecution was interested in keeping the matter from the friends of the accused, for the Stevens family were known to have many friends in high places in the colonies, and they might interfere in the coming trial. Cora Waters lived for weeks in ignorance of the peril of the man she loved. Her father had come home, her uncle was with them again, and she was almost happy. Poor child of misfortune, she had never known real happiness. Bleak winter was taking his departure, and a smiling spring promised to be New England's guest. Hope and peace and newness of life always come with spring. Spring gladdens the heart and rejuvenates the aged. One morning, while the frosty breath of winter yet lingered on the air, Cora Waters, who was an early riser, saw a large ship entering the harbor. The wind was dead against the vessel, but she was skilfully handled and tacked this way and that, and gradually worked her way into the harbor. A wreath of smoke from one of her ports was followed by the heavy report of a cannon, which salute was answered by a shot from the shore. "The ship will soon be in," the girl declared. "I will go and see it." In small seaport towns, such as Boston was at that day, the appearance of a ship caused as much excitement as the arrival of a train on a new railroad in a western village does today. Many people were hastening down to the beach where the boat would bring in passengers. Some were expecting friends, others had letters from loved ones across the sea, but Cora had no such excuse. It was simply girlish curiosity which induced her to go with the crowd to the beach. Boats had been lowered from the vessel, which, having no deck, could not get into shore and was forced to cast anchor some distance off. The boats filled with passengers were rowed ashore. Cora stood with a careless, idle air, gazing on the gentlemen and ladies as they disembarked. None specially excited her interest. Many were there greeting relatives and friends, but she had no friend or relative, and what were all these people to her? She was about to turn away, when a face and pair of dark blue eyes attracted her attention. She involuntarily started, and stared impudently at the stranger, her heart beating and her breath coming in short, quick gasps. That face, I have seen in my dreams, she thought. It was the pale face of a woman, still beautiful, although her features showed lines of suffering and anxiety. She was dressed in black from head to foot, and a veil of jet black was wound round her head. For a few moments she stood looking about, and then came directly to Cora and asked, "Young maid, do you live in this town?" "I do, for the present," Cora answered, though she instinctively trembled, for that voice, too, sounded like a long-forgotten dream. What strange spell was this which possessed her? The woman asked, "Can you direct me to a house of public entertainment?" "Come with me." Cora knew that the lady had suffered with seasickness and was anxious to reach land. She hastened with her to a public house kept by a widow Stevens, whose husband was a distant relative of Charles. As they walked up the hill toward the house, the woman continued to ply Cora with questions. "Are you a native of America?" she asked. "No." "England is your birthplace?" "It is." "Have you been long here?" "I was quite a child when we came," she answered. "Have you lived a long while in this town?" "Only a few months," she answered. They had nearly reached their destination, when Cora saw her father coming toward them. At sight of his daughter's companion, the face of the father became white as death, and bounding forward, he pulled her aside, saying, "No, no, Cora, you shall not go another step with her." At sound of his voice, the woman in black seized his arm and cried, "George! George! George!" "Away! Away!" "No, no! Now that I have found you, I will not let you go. You may kill me, cut off my hands, and still the fingers will cling to you. Oh God, I thank thee, that after so many years thou hast answered my prayers." "Woman, release me!" "George! George!" Cora was lost in a maze of bewilderment. She was conscious of the strange woman in black clutching her father's arm and calling him George, while he strove to drive her away. A great throng of people gathered about them. Mr. Waters became rude in his efforts to break away. At last he flung her off, and she fell, her forehead striking on the sharp corner of a stone, which started the blood trickling down her fair white brow. The woman swooned. Sight of blood touched the heart of George Waters, and, stooping, he raised the inanimate form in his arms as tenderly as if she had been an infant, and bore her to a public house and a private room. When the woman in black recovered consciousness, she and George Waters were alone, and he was tenderly dressing the wound he had made. "George," she said with a smile, "you will let me talk with you now?" "Yes." "George, you believed me guilty when you abandoned me at Edinburgh?" "Yes." "You do yet?" "I do." "George, Joseph Swartz told you a falsehood." "No, no, woman, do not hold, George. Let me show you his dying confession. Let me show you the testimony of a priest." She took up a small red leather bag, such as was used in those days by ladies, undid the strings, and, opening it, drew forth some papers, which she handed to him. "Do you know the writing?" she asked. "This is Joseph Swartz, my best and truest friend." "No, no. Read his deathbed confession, and you will see he was your malignant foe." He read the paper through, and his hands trembled with excitement, astonishment, and rage. He was about to say something, when she interrupted him with, "No, no, don't, George. He is dead. Let us forgive. If you want more proof, I have it. See Father Healy's statement. He took Joseph Swartz's confession." Glancing at the paper, he threw it aside, and cried, "Honor, Honor, forgive me. I should have believed you, not him. I stole your child, and, like a foolish man, ran away without questioning you. I have been 16 years seeking these proofs. I would not have come without them. You are forgiven, for, now that you have the proof, you believe." When George Waters went out of the room, he was met by his daughter Cora, who asked, "Father, who is she, the woman in black?" "An angel, your mother." "May I see her?" "Yes, at once," and he led her to the apartment. End of chapter 19. Recording by Elvira.
Chapter 20 of The Witch of Salem. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by hearhis.com. The Witch of Salem by John R. Musick. Chapter 20. Conclusion. How calm, how beautiful comes on the steely hour when storms are gone, when warring winds have died away, and clouds beneath the glancing ray melt off and leave the land and sea sleeping in bright tranquillity, fresh as if day again were born, again upon the lap of morn. More. In his dungeon cell, Charles Stevens learned that the veil of mystery which, like a threatening cloud, had enshrouded the life of Cora Waters was lifted, and the sunlight for the first time streamed upon her soul. She knew a mother's love. Her parents, estranged since her infancy, were again united. Such incidents are told in song and story, but are seldom known in reality. Charles heard the story in all its details related by his mother on one of her visits. He also learned that the colony of Virginia, by royal sanction, had granted a pardon to Mr. George Waters for the death of one James Martin, late overseer to Thomas Hull. "I am glad they are happy, mother," the unhappy prisoner said. "It is the reward which in the end awaits the just," she said. "They have forgotten me." "Charles, why say you that?" "Had not Cora Waters forgotten me, surely she would have visited me while sick and in prison." "They have just heard of it," she answered. "Just heard of it?" he repeated, amazed. "I have lain here pining in this dungeon for 3 long weeks, and you tell me but they have just heard of it?" "I am assured they have." "Mother, that seems impossible. Why, I thought all the world knew it." "But few know of it, my son. It seems to be the scheme of the prosecutors to keep the matter secret. You have not written? You have sent no message?" "No, mother." "Then pray, how could they learn of it, save by the merest accident? A passing stranger bore the news." Charles Stevens heaved a sigh. "Perhaps 'tis so. But it would seem that my groans and sighs must be heard round the world. Yet neither Cora Waters nor Adelpha Lyser, whose side I stood a comforter in the dark hours of trouble, has seen fit to offer me one word of consolation." "I trow, Charles, that Adelpha knows it not. Cora is coming." "Who hath told you?" "A friend from Boston brings information that the Waters brothers, with the newly found wife and mother of Cora, are coming to Salem to do all in their power to aid you." Charles sadly shook his head and said, "My poor friends can do nothing for me." "They can at least offer you consolation and comfort." "Yes, but what more? That is much." "True, and I appreciate it. I could not think that Cora would forget me. Neither would Adelpha, if she knew." His mother, after waiting some time for her son to resume, at last said, "Charles, if your choice were left to you, which of the two, Adelpha or Cora, would you wed?" Charles, smiling, answered, "Mother, it is not for one living within the shadow of the scaffold to think of marriage." "Charles, Can you really think your case so serious?" "I do, mother. I know it." "Oh, Charles, surely they will not condemn you. They have no proof. You are innocent." "I am innocent, mother, but that is no reason that evidence will not be produced against me." "Yet it will be false." "False, of course. Yet many have been hung on testimony as false as Satan himself." "Oh, Charles, what shall we do?" "Trust in the Lord, mother. When all earthly help is gone, we can only look to God for aid. I have prayed to him that if it be his will this cup might pass. Yet his will, not mine, be done. If I must die a martyr to that woman's falsehood, I pray he may give me sufficient strength to endure the trial." The mother fell on the neck of her son, crying, "You shall not die. Oh, my son, my son!" Charles comforted his mother as well as he could, and she took her leave. All was dark and gloomy. He knew that malice and hatred pursued him, caught his throat, and would not let go its hold until it dragged him to death. He was buried in the midst of his gloomy reflections when the door of his cell opened, and a jailer, entering, said,
"Another visitor for you, Charles Stevens."
"Another visitor? Who can it be?" he asked.
"It is I."
And Samuel Parris entered. For a moment Charles Stevens was struck dumb at the audacity of the pastor of Salem in venturing to enter the cell of one whom he had wronged. Though the power of Mr. Parris was on the wane, it was not wholly gone. He took advantage of the confusion of Charles Stevens to signal the jailer to leave them, and he went out, closing the iron door behind him. Folding his arms on his breast, Parris gazed at the prisoner. Charles Stevens, about whose waist was a thick belt of leather, fastened by a chain to the wall, sat on a miserable cot, his face bowed in his hands. He did not look up at the white, cadaverous face and the great blazing orbs which gleamed with fury upon him, although he knew full well that those eyes were on him.
"Charles,"
the deep sepulchre voice at last spoke. "Well?"
"Look up."
With a sigh, the young prisoner raised his head. Every movement he made was accompanied by the rattling of chains.
"Charles, you will not believe me when I tell you I am sorry for this."
"No, I will not."
"Nevertheless, I am. Charles Stevens, you do not know me. The world misjudges me, and all future generations will do the same. Some things which I have done may seem harsh, yet I was commanded of heaven to do them."
"Samuel Parris, if you have come to upbraid me, to gloat over my captivity, and add to my misery, do so. I am powerless and cannot resist you, but I do entreat you not to blaspheme your Maker." The great eyes of Parris gleamed with sullen fire. His thin lips parted. His breath came short and quick, and for a few moments he was unable to answer. At last, becoming calmer, he said in his deep sepulchre voice,
"Charles, do you not like me?"
"I confess it."
"I have rebuked you for your sinful associations, and the wicked dislike rebuke. The devil said to the Savior, when he would cast them out, 'Let us alone. We have naught to do with thee.' Everywhere in this life the sinner says, 'Leave me alone.' Yet it is my calling to go forth and snatch brands from the burning. Charles, why will you not denounce the child of that player?"
"She hath done no wrong."
"Do you love her?"
"That is a question you have no right to ask, or expect me to answer."
"I have read it in your heart."
"I have no answer."
"What have you to say in extenuation of your conduct hitherto?"
"Nothing."
"Why did you return to Salem?"
"It is my home."
Did you not anticipate this accusation?
No.
What do you expect now?
Death.
Have you no hope of escaping?
None.
But you seem calm and collected.
Why should I not?
Most men fear death.
True.
And do not you?
I would rather live.
What would you consent to do to save your life?
Nothing dishonorable.
What I am about to propose is by no means dishonorable, but honorable and fair in every particular.
Proceed.
You are charged with the death of Samuel Williams. Whether you be guilty or not, it is quite clear that Williams is dead. Now, it is the duty of someone to care for the widow. She is young.
Hold, Mr. Parris. If you are going to propose that I shall wed Sarah Williams, spare your words. I will not.
Charles Stevens, do you seek death?
None should wed where the heart is not. That bold, unscrupulous woman has already won my contempt.
Have a care.
Go tell her that Charles Stevens prefers death on the gibbet to becoming her husband.
Mr. Parris gazed on the helpless prisoner for a few minutes. His thin lips curled with a sneering smile.
Charles Stevens, he said in low, measured tones, you are a fool. Do you know what it is to die? Have you counted the cost of a leap in the dark?
No sane man courts death. Yet, to the Christian who hath kept God's commands, the monster is robbed of half its terrors. God has wisely constituted us so that we dread death. If we did not, we would not be willing to endure the misfortunes, disappointments, and ills which afflict us from the cradle to the grave. But the Christian can say, "Welcome to death," in preference to dishonor. I thank my God, Samuel Parris, that I can, with the prophets of old, say, "O grave, where is thy victory?"
Charles Stevens, have you ever thought that, after all, this too may be a delusion? That the Bible may be only the uninspired works of man, and that there may be no beyond, no God, save nature?
So, you have turned atheist, cried Charles. Perhaps you have been one all along.
Charles Stevens, one cannot help their doubts.
One need not be a hypocrite, Mr. Parris. One can even drive doubts away. The true Christian never doubts and never fears. Pray for faith. Have faith in your prayers. Believe and ask God to help your unbelief, and doubts will disappear.
Charles, you are too young, too wise to die. Accept Sarah Williams and live.
Never! Away, hypocrite, schemer! Begone! The pastor, quite humbled, turned and went from the prison. There was a malignant gleam in his great wicked eyes, which boded the unfortunate prisoner no good. For several weeks longer Charles Stevens languished in prison. Cora, her father and mother, came to Salem and visited him. When Cora Waters gazed on the young man, from whom she had parted a few weeks before in the full vigor of his young life and strength, and saw him emaciated, weak, and pale, so that she scarcely knew him, she broke down and wept. The two were left alone in the cell. Then Charles told her how uncertain were his chances of life, and how impending his prospects of death. He could not quit this life without telling her that he loved her, and that he wished to live to make her his wife. Though that pleasure was forever denied him, it would make his last days more agreeable to know that his love was returned. What answer could she make? She, whose fondest hope this had been, said nothing, but with heart overflowing she threw her arms about the prisoner and burst into tears. Had she won him only to lose him? Was he to be snatched from her side at the very moment that she found him her own? "No, no, no, they shall not, they shall not," she sobbed. From that day Cora shared the imprisonment of her lover, so far as the jailer would permit. She added to his comfort and assured him that her undying love would follow him to the grave. Their hopes rose and sank as the day of the trial drew near. The fatal day came at last, and Charles was arraigned before the court of Oyer and Terminer on charge of the murder of one Samuel Williams. He pleaded not guilty, and made every preparation for defense. It was like fighting a masked battery, for they knew not what the evidence would be against him. The trial opened, and Sarah Williams, to make the scene more effective, came dressed in black and looking very pale. She was called to the stand, and, between tears and sobs, told her sad story of how her loving husband had one day quarreled with the defendant, and the latter had threatened him. Was anyone else present? Yes. John Bly and Mr. Louder were both present when he threatened to kill her husband. Charles Stevens remembered having a slight altercation when he was quite a boy with Mr. Williams, but it was such a trivial matter that he had forgotten it till now. Then she told that her loving husband feared he would be slain by Charles Stevens, and that he went away to New York City on a voyage, and that the same day Charles Stevens had come to her house and asked her whither her husband had gone, and she had every evidence to believe he went after him. There were other witnesses who swore that about this time Charles Stevens left the town and was gone away for some time. Charles remembered that on that occasion he had taken a journey to Rhode Island. Then came two strangers, evidently seafaring men of the lowest order. They were brutal, unscrupulous, and had lived the lives of buccaneers, as was afterward proved. Both swore that they knew the defendant, although he had never seen either before. They saw the defendant slay Samuel Williams on Long Island, near the beach, and both gave a graphic account of his dragging the body along the sand and hurling it into the water, where the tide bore it away. Their statements were corroborative. Bly and Louder were next produced, who gave evidence that the defendant had confessed to them that he had slain Samuel Williams, and that defendant was greatly enamored of the murdered man's wife. Mr. Parris and others testified to having seen him in the company of Sarah Williams on divers of times, and that he had shown great fondness for her.
"What have you to say to this evidence?" asked the Chief Justice to the prisoner.
"I can only say they are all grievous liars."
"The jury will take notice how the defendant assaults men of unquestioned character. Even the minister is assailed."
There was a murmur of discontent, in which even some of the jury joined. Judges, jury, and prosecutors were all against Charles, and his trial must result in conviction. The people were excited at the dastardly murder, and began to complain at the delay in the trial, which wore tediously on day after day for nearly a week. At last the evidence was all in, and the last argument made. There was everything against the prisoner. The prosecution had been so skillfully planned and executed that there could be but one result. Charles Stevens was very calm, while Cora was carried away in a fainting condition. Mr. Waters went to the prisoner to speak with him. Charles' face was white as death, but his mind was clear and showed not the least agitation. "There can be but one result," the prisoner said. "An acquittal is impossible. Be good to Cora and mother, and keep them both away on that day. It would be too much for them. They would not forget it to their dying hour." Mr. Waters assured him that his last request should be granted, and spoke a few words of consolation and hope. So many good people of late had perished on the gibbet, that hanging was no longer ignominious. The best and purest had died thus. The jury had been out but a few moments, when a great hubbub arose without, and voices could be heard crying, "Wait! Wait! Stay the verdict!" A crowd of men rushed into the courtroom, with a tall young man, whose weather-beaten face indicated a seafaring life, at the head of them. His cruel gray eyes, bold manner, as well as the pistols and cutlass at his belt, gave him the appearance of a pirate.
"I am not dead, I trow. Who said I was dead?" he asked.
"Samuel Williams, alive!" cried a score of voices.
"Who said I was murdered?"
Sarah Williams rose with a shriek and stared at her husband as if he had been an apparition, while all the witnesses, including the Reverend Mr. Parris, were covered with confusion. The jury was recalled, and Samuel Williams himself took the stand. He stated,
"I left my wife because I could not live with her, and Mary. I would prefer hanging to existence with her. I went to New York, where Captain Robert Kidd was beating up recruits to sail as a privateer in the Adventurer, to protect commerce against the French privateers and sea robbers. I enlisted, and then, with 150 men, Kidd did good service on the American coast, and we went to the Indian Ocean to attack pirates. Our plunder from the pirates made us long to gain more booty, and Kidd became a pirate himself. Armed with cutlass and pistols, we were made to board many vessels, English as well as other nationalities. We went to South America, the West Indies, and finally came to New York, where Captain Kidd, one dark night, landed on Gardiner's Island east of Long Island, with an enormous treasure of gold, jewels, and precious stones, which he buried in the earth. From there we came to Boston. A pardon had been granted for all, save Kidd, who was yesterday arrested and sent to England to be tried. I heard that a man had been arrested for my murder, and I hastened to save him."
Kidd was subsequently tried, condemned, and hung in chains, but his treasure on Gardiner's Island has not to this day been found. The romantic story of the returned pirate produced the most profound sensation among the people in the courtroom. The jury had just voted on a verdict of guilty, when they were recalled and instructed to give a verdict of acquittal, which they did. Mr. Parris retired in humiliation and disgrace. Cora fainted in her rescued lover's arms, while Mrs. Stevens, falling on her knees, thanked God that the light of heaven at last shone on the path so long dark. Cora's mother came to take her from the liberated prisoner, but he would not give her up, holding her until she regained consciousness, when all went home together, a happy and united family. Almost in a twinkling of an eye, the delusion was dispelled, and many who had been wronged hastened, so far as in them lay, to make reparation. The bigoted and fanatical, if we may not say hypocritical, preachers were displaced by God-fearing, righteous ministers who were more liberal, exercising common sense, and possessing humanity as well as godliness, which is ever essential to a good minister. They were liberal even to the player's child as well as to the players themselves. George and Henry Waters both became citizens of Salem, and Charles and Cora were married 3 months after the acquittal of the former. Their lives were eventful, with as much happiness as is commonly allotted to mortals of earth, and they left 9 children, all brought up in the fear of the Lord and lovers of liberty. Witchcraft prosecutions were doomed, and shortly after the acquittal of Charles Stevens, in no singular a manner, they altogether ceased to prosecute. The imprisoned witches and wizards were reprieved and set free. Reluctant to yield, the party of superstition were resolved on one conviction. The victim selected was Sarah Datston, a woman 80 years old, who for 20 years had borne the undisputed reputation of a witch. If ever there was a witch in the world, she, it was said, was one. Her trial was conducted at Charleston. in the presence of a great throng. There was more evidence against her than any tried at Salem, but the common mind, disenthralled of the hideous delusion, asserted itself through the jury by a verdict of acquittal. Cotton Mather, who was thoroughly imbued with the delusion to cover his confusion, got up a case of witchcraft in his own parish. He averred the miracles were wrought in Boston. Cotton Mather does not seem to have been bloodthirsty, though he was more anxious to protect his vanity than his parishioners, and his bewitched neophyte, profiting by his cautions, was afflicted by veiled spectres. The imposture was promptly exposed to ridicule by one who was designated as a malignant, calumnious, and reproachful man, a coal from hell. It was the uncultured but rational Robert Califf. Cotton Mather wrote and spoke much on the subject of witchcraft, long after the delusion had vanished. The inexorable indignation of the people of Salem village drove Parris from the place. Noyes confessed his error and guilt, asked forgiveness, and devoted the remainder of his life to deeds of charity. Sewall, one of the judges, by rising in his pew in the Old South Meeting House on a fast day, and reading to the whole congregation a paper in which he bewailed his great offense, recovered public esteem. Stoughton and Cotton Mather never repented. The former lived proud, unsatisfied, and unbeloved. The latter attempted to persuade others and himself that he had not been specifically active in the tragedy. His diary proves that he did not wholly escape the impeachment of conscience, for it is stated that Cotton Mather, who had sought the foundation of faith in tales of wonders himself, had temptations to atheism and to the abandonment of all religion as mere delusion. As when a storm clears away, it leaves the atmosphere clearer, so the common mind of New England became more wise, by employing a cautious spirit of search, eliminating error, rejecting superstition as tending toward cowardice and submission. The people cherished religion as a source of courage and a fountain of freedom, and forever after refused to separate belief from reason. The actual fate of Mr. Parris is not certainly known. Some have intimated that he died of a loathsome disease, others that, like Judas, he took his own life. But we are assured that he received his share of earthly torment for his base hypocrisy and cruel wrongs. Most of the people who pretended to be afflicted afterward made confessions admitting their error. Efforts were made by the legislature to make amends for some of the great wrongs done at Salem, but such wrongs can never be righted. The victims of Parris hate and avarice have slept for 200 years on Witch's Hill, and there await the trump that shall rouse the dead when the just shall be separated from the unjust. Salem village is peaceful, happy, and quiet. In the gentle murmur of waves, the whisper of breezes, and the laugh of babbling brooks about the quaint old town, all nature seems to rejoice that the age of superstition has passed. End of chapter 20. Chapter recorded by hearhis.com. End of The Witch of Salem by John R. Musick.